All right, I think we're recording now. I am here with one of my good friends, Dr. Ambika Kamath, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell us what you study, what you do, what your job is.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, my name is Ambika Kamath. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, where basically what a postdoc is someone who is in between their PhD and another job of some kind. Very often, people are looking to get professor positions. That's what I'm doing at the moment, but I'm not 100% sure about that yet. We can get to that later. And the research that I do is I study the evolution of animal behavior, and the way that I think about that, I study a whole bunch of different things, ranging from individual variation in habitat use to mating systems to animal architecture and collective behavior. And I study this in lizards and spiders and caterpillars. And it's all a big mess sometimes, it feels like that, but the underlying principle is, or the underlying approach is that I'm interested in how individuals move through the space available to them. The idea being that how you move through the space determines not only what environments you encounter and therefore what natural selection pressures you face, but also which other individuals you encounter and therefore what the social selection pressures you face. So I sort of view individual variation in animals' movement behavior as this way of integrating all of these different aspects of these animals' lives, to understand how animal behavior evolved in these messy natural contexts.
Very cool. I think many of my students every semester find the animal behavior part of the curriculum definitely the most exciting and interesting. Can you back up and talk through how did you decide that was what you wanted to study? And we can get through more of the how did you go to grad school and what grad school is like later, or you can sort of weave that in. But just as far as figuring out that this idea of moving through space and figuring out when did that become like the thing that you knew you wanted to study?
Yeah, so I think what I've always been interested in is just trying to understand how variation is organized, or like to make sense of the huge variation that you see in the natural world. And I think most people I think a lot of biologists tend to be interested in variation between species, why species A is different than species B, over these longer time scales of evolution. Somehow that's never been the scale at which I think. I always have been most fascinated by why one individual is different from another and why they behave differently over sort of the time scales of their daily lives. And I've been interested in this in plants as well as animals. And as an undergrad, I had the opportunity to do research in labs that worked in both plants, sort of pollination, not pollination, sort of plant reproduction from a genetic perspective, and also sort of a flower morphology and pollination perspective. And then I also had the chance to work on plant-animal interactions, and then just some straight up animal ecology. And so I don't know, so the choice to work in animals was a little bit up in the air. It could have gone either way. I feel like I like thinking of myself as having started out as a plant biologist back in the day, and it's influenced the way that I work for sure, because people when working on plants have much more sensible ways of quantifying sex and sexual function in a way that animal biologists struggle to do, because we are also animals and we come in with our preconceived notions, and we can get that later too. But yeah, anyways, so I was motivated broadly by this question of understanding how variation is structured. That is what I fundamentally find interesting within species, across populations, within populations. And then for a while, I just sort of studied everything that was interesting to me. And then I sort of looked back at that at the end of my PhD and tried to figure out what the narrative was, like what it was that was linking all of those. And then that's when that movement behavior as a root into understanding animal ecology and evolution came into being. So it was very much for a little while I trusted my intuition and just did the things that I thought were interesting. And I was lucky that my PhD advisor was fine with that. And then the actual structure emerged later.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you were doing what felt like a lot of sort of very different things within this bigger field. And then it wasn't until the end of your PhD that you really honed in on this is the thing.
Yes, exactly. And then I honed in on it at the end of my PhD. And then in my postdoctoral work, took that framework explicitly and applied it to the new systems that I was working in these different labs. And so then that thread is sort of solidified and grown in different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see. Some scientists will work on one specific species. Obviously, a lot of people in our department use model systems. And so it makes sense that a whole career in this one organism. And so I think for some people, seeing a scientist that has bounced around from plants to animals and a lot of different kind of animals, it can feel like, how do you make those transitions? And so I think that's a really interesting progression.
And there's also like other people that study a single question and study it in different organisms. Right. And I don't do either of those things. And so it stresses people out, including me sometimes. Like, what am I doing? But there is an underlying logic, and I've learned to trust that underlying logic. So yeah, it's working okay so far.
That's great. So was it you liked research in undergrad and it was a pretty easy decision to go to grad school, or how did you make that, okay, I'm going to grad school decision?
Yeah, I did not consider anything else. Like, it was just very obvious to me that was what I wanted to do. I was fortunate enough to meet a behavioral ecologist while I was in high school. And so I was aware of the existence of that as an option. And he was one of my really formative mentors in high school. He somehow, at the time I wanted to be a mathematician, I think, or maybe a math person, or I wanted to be a lab biologist or a doctor. And he somehow saw that he could get my mathy brain interested in evolution and the natural world. And then it just clicked, and I went from there. So I was aware this is a career path for a very long time, to the extent that I don't think I actually explored other options at all until graduate school. I didn't even comprehend what other things I might be able to do until I was in graduate school.
Until graduate school.
And so my one, when I give advice to people now, actually, I think the generic advice would be don't lock yourself into any one thing. Whether that's research, whether that's med school, whether that's something else, whether or not that thing is a mainstream thing or something not quite mainstream, don't lock yourself into one thing. And what I wish I had done is taken time after undergrad to work in something that was entirely not related to academia or science. But I didn't do that.
So now you're a postdoc. Do you have, what sort of career do you envision for yourself at this point, knowing, of course, that you're not locking yourself into any one thing?
Yeah, so what I've been trying to do lately, and I've been talking and thinking about this quite a bit, is really trying to find a set of values or a set of organizing principles of my life, and being open to any career path that would let me fulfill those values, right? And so, and at the moment, and part of it, and that's one motivation. And the other motivation is also that I've gone pretty far in academia. I feel like I want to give it a shot. I want to try and be a research professor, or a professor who both teaches and does research in some balance of those, either at a research-focused institution or at a more teaching-focused institution. But I think what's more important to me is that I'm surrounded by people that have similar beliefs in the power of education as an equalizing force, in the value of understanding how research is influenced by the people that we are, how the fact that different people ask different questions, and the importance of diversity in science, those values, or in any institution. Those are more important to me than the kind of institution I would like to be at. So I'm trying to. Sorry, go ahead.
I appreciate that point a lot. I think students often hear the advice about what do you want to do? What do you want to do? But I think a different and equally important way of thinking about is what kind of place do you want to be?
Right. And who is the person that you want to be? Start with who is the person that you want to be? What is the life that person would lead? What's important to that person? And then what's the career path that will let you get there, right? And I think what I've been lucky to have so far is in steps along the way that have positioned me that I have that choice. That's been luck and hard work and a bunch of other things, but privilege and but it's now that I have that choice, I'm trying to use it in a way that seems consistent with the person that I want to be.
Yeah. So you mentioned diversity in science. Can you talk a little more about the particular importance of diversity in science for you, or for how maybe the importance of diversity for the field and how that's sometimes missed?
Yeah. So my research, in graduate school, I was sort of chugging along trying to understand different aspects of animal behavior, and also sort of concurrently and mostly in parallel learning about feminism and learning about like why being a feminist is important, learning about the ways in which bias and discrimination and harassment are pervasive in the world at large and in academia in particular. Academia is especially susceptible to it because it has this very strong hierarchical power structure. So I was learning all of those things, and then I was also studying lizard mating systems. And these lizard mating systems were really baffling because on the one hand, we had these descriptions of these animals' behavior that suggested that these males have a territory, females have smaller territories within, and the idea was that males prevent other males from coming into those territories and have therefore maintain exclusive mating access to the females that they sort of quote unquote own or maintain within their territories, right? And then so that's the behavioral data. And then there was genetic data saying, no, females are mating with multiple males all the time. Like to the extent that if those males are trying to maintain exclusive mating access, they're doing a horrible job of it, right?
Not
and
just
so,
a rare one exception, but a much
more. Yeah, exactly. It was something like so the species that I was working on, 80% of females mate with multiple males, and that is not something that you can explain away as an anomaly, right? I mean, and so what hit me at that time was, so I was learning about these lizards and then I started watching them and realizing that their behavior did not conform to that territorial description in all of these ways. And it seemed pretty obvious to me, like even from just a little bit of observation. So I was confused why that had happened. And then it suddenly clicked that, okay, if different people, so feminism teaches you that different people bring all of this weight of their identity and their experience to every interaction they have with each other, with other people. Surely we're bringing that same weight of identity and experience to the way in which we observe animals as well, right? And then sort of that kind of became my PhD research and work that I've been doing subsequently as well in collaboration with social scientists and stuff. So for me, this idea that different people can ask questions differently about the natural world is in one sense a very obvious reason why you want diversity in science, right? I am sure that I would not have been asking those questions if I was not a woman and a woman of color and learning about feminism. The research questions that I addressed in my PhD. But that's sort of a very utilitarian way of thinking about it. There's also there's for the good of science. So it makes for better science, but it also just makes for a better world, right? Like I think even if all of us asked exactly the same questions, and science would not objectively better for fostering diversity, it would still be the right thing to do.
Right.
And I think sometimes in science we worry so much about this idea, like this notion that the best idea has to win, or the best, in the idea of a meritocracy, really. But like we all do, no individual person is all that brilliant, and we all do good enough work that it's okay to care about things in addition to quote unquote meritocracy, which in and of itself does not,
Sure.
Yeah.
But so it's the right thing to do, obviously, but also this interesting thing that legitimately leads to better science in a way that is easy to document and demonstrate.
Absolutely. And I think the field of animal behavior is the easiest place to see that, because animal behavior is so closely tied to human behavior, and so there's a lot of exchange that we don't even do intentionally. It comes about implicitly between the values that we have and the ideas that we have in animals, and we project them onto the ideas that we have in humans, and we project them onto animals. And like one thing that's really interesting to think about in this context, so if you use the historical perspective, which is something that I did in my PhD, is like look at the history of research of the subject, you can see things change as people's values change. Our interpretations of animal behaviors change as our own values change. And so it becomes easy to see this in action. Yeah.
So here you are, a diligent graduate student. You're learning all about the reproductive behavior of these lizards, and you're reading in the papers that it's this one system where the males are controlling, reproductive access, and then you find this genetic literature that says exactly the opposite. And you're out in the field, you're making your own observations that says this long-standing body of literature doesn't make sense. Obviously it's not just a decision you make, but at some point you must start from the assumption, I must be wrong, I must be missing something. And then you gain the confidence to say, no, everyone is missing something. And what was that process like for you, and how was it received and all of that?
Yeah. So the initial thing that kept me going and got me into this project was that mismatch, right? The fact that the behavioral data, everybody else's behavioral data and everybody else's genetic data were not matching up, right? So regardless of what I do, there's something interesting in that gap. So however my work turned out, it was going to be interesting. So that was sort of the initial, and so I didn't really need to have too much confidence in myself at that point. It was just like, okay, everybody else's work is just not lining up. What I'm bringing to the table is that I'm upset about the fact that this is not lining up. Lots of other biologists acknowledge that they don't line up. And so that therefore you'll see in your textbook the difference between a social mating system and a genetic mating system. And as a field, behavioral ecology has sort of been in this position of cognitive dissonance where it's like, it's okay for those things to not match up, even though you cannot have, exactly, like there has to be behavior involved, there have to be social interactions involved in bringing about any mating system. So for me, the motivation was, we're clearly missing something about their behavior, that something is going to be interesting, so I'll just keep working on it.
Or it's third horizontal gene transfer, that some bizarre mechanism.
Right. It could have been anything, right? It could have been something it could have been anything, but it was going to be something different because there was that gap, right? And then
you're a scientist, and there's this unanswered question that just fascinates you and that you find important.
Exactly.
You won't let it go.
Exactly. Yeah. I was legitimately upset about why nobody else was upset. It was very. Now I've sort of relaxed about it a little bit now, but yeah, anyway. And then what happened was, and then I did this, and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this empirical work, this like field work and lab work to like try and actually bring together, see if you can set aside this whole framework of territoriality and bring together a behavioral and genetic restriction mating systems. But if I do it in just one population, which is all that, it's very logistically intensive work. So like that was all that I had the time and money for. Like everyone could be like, oh, that one population is weird. Like nothing is actually, you haven't shown anything. Right. So I knew that I had to do things differently. So that was where like I started to think about, okay, how is this going to be received? And so then what I ended up doing was this historical analysis and review of basically every single paper published on Anolis lizard territoriality. So this was about 100 papers published over about a 70-year period. And I read every single one of them and tried to understand where this idea had come from and really evaluate the evidence that we had in favor of it, for it, supporting this idea of territoriality from a position of some skepticism. And what I discovered was that basically no one had ever really stopped to test the idea. The initial data for it was very strange back in the 1930s. It was interesting, but it was just not conclusive at all. But people happily made the conclusion that these animals are territorial. And then the idea just sort of became entrenched in the field. And basically once you implicitly or explicitly believe that a species is territorial, the way that you design your research on their behavior becomes very difficult to find any data that does not support the same question of territoriality. So you get stuck.
In these other papers, you were able to point to specific aspects of the experimental design that were based on this initial faulty assumption that were sort of self-fulfilling. Exactly right. Yeah. So the way that you like simple things like how long your study runs for, how big of an area you sample over, those decisions have huge impacts on whether or not you would be able to detect a departure from territoriality. Right.
Even though like if your species is territorial, they're completely reasonable decisions to make. So it wasn't as though any one person was doing anything outrageous, but because there was this notion in the air that these species are territorial, everyone just proceeded accordingly and no one stopped to think about another option.
Yeah.
Until that disjunct between those two data, which is so vast, and then you had someone coming along and being upset about it, and so like it needed that combination of things.
That's awesome. That's such a wonderful story, and I'm glad that it has started to be picked up and paid attention
to.
Yeah,
and so people, so in terms of the reception, a lot of people yell at me a lot. Almost every time I give a talk, people like about 2/3 of the way through, there'll be a bunch of people who just like stop looking at me and they get really angry and they just like look away and have to control their feelings. And I've gotten a fair number of hostile questions every time these papers go out to review. One reviewer will get very angry and like sort of take out their feelings on the page. But there's been enough and more positive support that I think it makes it still worth it to keep doing. And I think there are enough people that are really like thinking about this stuff differently now because of it. And so I'm excited for that. And I've like eventually, it's still very upsetting to get yelled at, especially by senior academics, but which happens to be with some regularity. But now I've mostly gotten used to it.
Mostly gotten used to it. Interesting.
Yeah.
But that it's an interest. There's nobody likes negative criticism. As scientists, we sort of think that we're objective, and of course, we want the criticism, but we are not always professional or kind in the way we deliver that criticism. So, especially for someone at sort of more junior ranks in this, in this academia, that takes a lot to sort of put yourself out there and do that over and over again. But it sounds like you're saying that happens, and it's not like you're immune to it, but you're also seeing this other positive response on the opposite end of the spectrum that kind of makes it worth it and makes you willing to continue to subject yourself to that.
Absolutely. And also like the flip side, sort of an interesting addition to that is if you believe that scientists are inherently objective and then you sort of face this sort of criticism, it can be a lot more upsetting. It's much easier to sort of understand that different people are bringing different emotional energies to the table and nobody's actually all that objective. Not only is it easier to take the criticism because you're like, okay, this reviewer they just got upset and like they're taking, like it doesn't actually necessarily mean that my science is all awful. And also because you have acknowledged to yourself this possibility that you are not objective, you hold yourself to a higher standard in your actual experimental design and like in the way that you do your work, because you're making sure, because you know that the world is going to sort of describe you as having an agenda. And so you need to be able to make sure that your agenda isn't actually creeping in, because I've seen how other people's implicit agendas have creeped in, and I have to make really sure that doesn't happen in my work as well, right? So I feel like you end up, once you acknowledge the possibility that you're not this objective robot, as a scientist, you end up doing better science simply because you have to guard against that.
And you're aware of it. That's
exactly. Yeah.
That's a lot. That's great. Thank you for sharing all of that. Can we back up just a little bit, sort of more nuts and bolts?
Mm-hmm.
I understand how varied your day is over the course of the year, but there is no typical day, but what do you actually do as a postdoc?
Yeah, what I actually do as a postdoc is all research, which is very strange because there's very little structure to my life. I have to build most of it. I don't have classes to go to or classes to teach. The way that I build structure is to have meetings. I try and like schedule meetings with collaborators. I've been doing a lot of as a graduate student, I did most of my work on my own, and now as a postdoc, I'm doing a lot of collaborative work, and that's been a really interesting and fun transition. So I think the way that a lot of my time is spent talking to other scientists who I'm working with or whose work I'm interested in. And then a lot of time is spent writing. And the other thing that I'm doing these days has been, I'm trying to develop research in a model system that is new to, or in a system that is new to me, and that hasn't had a huge amount of, isn't currently an actively used system, and that is tent caterpillars, which you may know. Tent caterpillars. So these are social caterpillars that build these tents together and they forage together, and they're great. And I'm trying to understand what living in variable resource distributions does to their collective behavior. And So this past year has been a lot of like reading about them and just sitting and watching them in the field and just like seeing what they're up to and trying to build a colony in the lab and seeing what they're up to. So my days involve some combination of talking to people, writing, and then I'm mentoring a few students, so like checking in with them, helping them learn how to analyze data, collect data, and all of that. And then just watching these caterpillars do their thing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So if you look back, most of my students are obviously undergrads. Can you think of any particular experiences of your own as an undergrad that sort of set you up well or best prepared you either for graduate school or for where you are now?
I think the thing that like really, I studied abroad. I did a study abroad program in South Africa where it's a field biology based program in which we went from one national park to the next, and in each of them did these little projects, some led by faculty, some that we did on our own. And that was a really fantastic experience. And I know that there are an increasingly varied range of these sorts of study abroad programs. I think I didn't like to get myself out of my comfort zone very much, and I think that was I wish I had been better at that, but I know who I was at the time, and so I'm not going to like judge myself too harshly for not being.
Here's my next question. What advice do you have for yourself as an undergrad looking back?
Yeah. So like looking back, I would say I would have encouraged myself to like push myself a little bit outside of my comfort zone and try things that I didn't know that I was good at, and see where that took me, because I was at my undergrad advisor encouraged me to do the study abroad program. I don't think I'd have thought of it otherwise, and I was very grateful for that. And otherwise, I don't know. I think like the other advice I would have, I guess I haven't really given you too many formative experiences, and part of that is difficult just because my undergrad was so weird. So what happened was weird in the sense that I got this scholarship that had recently been founded at Amherst College, which is where I did my undergrad, where they just gave you, they gave people who they sort of saw as having research promise, or scholarly promise, just a very large amount of money that we could do whatever we wanted with. So I was able to engineer a lot of research experiences for myself with that, but I realized that was a very odd and privileged opportunity. So but I think being not afraid to ask for things is like, or like to ask for help, right? To ask for advice, to ask for just guidance on how to get to where you want to be. And that's difficult because it involves knowing where you want to be or like having some sense of it. Sure. And that's really hard. But also like you can have a sense, and that sense can change tomorrow. It can change in 2 months. It can change next year. So like, and you'll still gain good experiences along the way. So that would be sort of like, think really carefully about what it is that you want to experience in whatever time frame that looks like to you. And don't be afraid to ask for advice and help to get that.
Yeah, that's great. So speaking of help, what does your current support network look like? Where do you go when you need help?
That is such a good question. Oh my goodness. So one wonderful thing about, I was lucky to have a really supportive PhD advisor. He has this philosophy that like once you are his student, he's stuck with you. So he is still my primary source for like advice on like navigating academia. I also have just so people like you, people that were a few years ahead of me in grad school, who have sort of seen a little bit more of the path that I'm going down, and I've been fortunate to be able to maintain connections with so many of you and get advice from all of you. Yeah, maintaining connections is a huge thing. Like whatever you end up like putting in the effort to maintain those connections.
And it can be hard, right? Because we get these jobs and we move all over the country, and this small network of grad students where you saw each other every day. Now you're in different times. I agree. I think that maintaining connections is is hard.
And you have to sort of be flexible about what maintaining looks like. Like we haven't docked in, I don't know, 6 months, a year, maybe more than that. But like, I still know that if like something came up where I wanted your advice, like I know that I could count on you for it, right? And so like having built up connections in a way such that you know that you can get back to people is useful. But yeah, so my support network, a lot of my peers from graduate school and peers from graduate school and people who I've met in different contexts. So in my graduate school, but also in like doing field work at conferences. I like people, so I'm always kind of looking out for ways to make connections with people, and that has served me well. But I think it's also really important to have a support network outside of your workplace where it doesn't matter whether your paper got accepted or not. It doesn't matter if you like got that grant or like had a good day at work or your lizard just like did something weird. Like people with whom your sense, like their appreciation of you, that has nothing to do with your work. And that's something that I've been building up much more over the last couple of years. And that's involved like getting support for mental health issues, like professional support, as well as just being more open with my friends about it and being able to talk with them about that. So all of that, I think, is really important as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
Do you have a failure story that you're comfortable sharing? I feel like a lot of times scientists as these people who have just achieved everything, and it's it's hard to relate to that. So I like asking the failure stories.
Yeah. So I went to high school in India. I grew up in India. Went to high school in India. I applied. I was like top of my class. I was like very confident in my academic abilities. And then I applied to college to like maybe undergraduate education in India is not all that great in many places, just in terms of a focus on like it's difficult to find places. It's changed a lot actually since I was an undergrad, but for the better. But like at the time there were really not that many places where you could have a scholarly undergraduate experience in the kind that I wanted. So I applied to like the 3 places that I thought I would that would be good for me, and I did not. I was like very confident. I did not get into any of them.
Okay.
And then I ended up like going somewhere else for a little while and just hating it and just like not being able to stay there. And so then I applied again the next time to those same 3 places, and I was like, well, I suppose I should apply to a few places like abroad as well. And I was again lucky enough to be able to have the resources to do that, because it's, at that time my confidence had taken something of a knock. And then again, like I only got into one place at the end of that. So like actually getting into college was not a straightforward task for me. And then since then, I mean, it's just been like, I think it becomes difficult to see the failures just because the end products turn out fine, but there've been so many steps of failures along the way that get you there. And those we don't end up talking about. Like I've had field seasons where just nothing worked. I've had like I went out and spent 2.5 months watching these lizards and nothing came of it. Nothing. I mean, I had ideas and they modified my thinking, but there's no tangible product that emerged from it. And that's sort of the struggle of like being a scientist or being like anyone who's a thinker in this day and age where everything is so focused on what you produce, is that it becomes difficult to see the value of those times where you just spend thinking and learning and your ideas are evolving, but nothing comes of it that is valued by society.
There, and what becomes visible is only those things, those products.
Those end results. Yeah. So like each of those products has had tons of little failures along the way that got it there.
That sort of disappear. Sure. Great. Thank you. So maybe my last question, then of course I'll end by giving you the opportunity to add anything else. But what do you think are some of the most interesting sort of big questions in ecology today as you talk to a lot of different questions? Like what excites you most about ecology broadly these days?
Yeah. The thing that excites me the most, I think, I'm sort of a Luddite in that I don't do genetic work very much. I'm bad at it. I'm really, I struggled so much to do, like, I did very basic genetics for my PhD, and it was so difficult. And I had done genetics as an undergrad. I was like, okay, I got this. I cannot do it. Anyway, so I think a lot of people you'd ask, like it's a lot of biologists would be excited about like, oh, what are the genetic bases of such and such trait? And like that is not exciting to me. What I think is exciting to me at the moment is just this, it's again a sort of idea that's floating around, that people are getting more and more comfortable with the idea that the world is a messy place and trying to incorporate that messiness into the way that we do our science. I think for the longest time, the way that we have done ecology, the way that we have done animal behavior, the way that we study evolution is thinking about ways of eliminating the mess. We make assumptions that eliminate the mess. We think of natural selection as a process that eliminates that mess, right? As that moves us to, and I think what the sort of sphere that my work is going in, and that I'm excited to, I'm sort of thinking a lot about how other people in different subfields of evolutionary biology and in that space as well, is like, okay, what happens when you start to accept that the world is always going to be messy and that there isn't this intentional, like we've sort of assumed this intentionality towards reducing the mess in natural systems, and that what happens if we set that aside, and what happens if we just say, okay, things are messy, can we quantify that mess? And that's possible because of the development of like computing power and statistical tools where you can do simulations, and you don't have to have analytical results for everything. You can do simulations, you can measure just a lot more stuff, like automated means of measuring behavior. That is something I was skeptical of, but I'm slowly warming up to it. Like you can just get a lot more data that charts that can allow you to describe that mess and start to make sense of it, I think, in a way that's going to end up actually being, my hunch is that we're going to end up seeing that the processes that we thought are important are actually not as important, and I'm excited to see what new processes emerge as being important in the natural world. And a lot of it might just be randomness.
Right.
You know?
And so potentially our understanding of these big, most important processes maybe have been sculpted by the needs of the technology at the time to ignore the mess. And now that we can to include the mess, maybe the relative importance of some of these huge processes will shift. That's
and it's great because now we have a really solid understanding of those huge processes, and so we know exactly what to look for when we're looking for them, and so we can still look for them, but also be like, okay, how do they play out in this broader mess? You know? So yeah, that's what's exciting to me.
Awesome, thank you. So if my students want to learn more about your work or follow you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So I'm on Twitter a lot. That's my primary place of online presence at the moment. So my handle is at Ambika Kamath, which is my first and last name squished together. So
I'll link in the.
And you'll link it. Okay, great. And then I also have a blog where I used to write, and I still write intermittently. And there's links to like all of the old blog posts in both science stuff and like what it's like being a person in science. There's writing on both of those things, and hopefully that would be helpful.
I always love reading all of those posts.
Thanks. Yeah, that's what I said.
Great. Yeah, so I'll make sure to put the Twitter and the blog links on the page.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for your time. Feel free to say no, that's it, but any parting words or anything that you wanted to add that we haven't really touched on?
No, thank you. This has been fun. I always like the chance to like step back and like reflect and pontificate on things. But let's see. Anything else? I think, okay, this is one thing that this touches back on the like always have other options thing.
Yeah.
I just want to re-stress that, right? Like in graduate school, I spent 3 years of my graduate school, at least 3 out of the 6 years, maybe 4, just completely convinced that I was not going to stay in academia. And at that led me to, I had this moment where I was like, I could decide to do research that would facilitate my staying in academia, right? That would get me this really high profile publication.
Sure.
But I realized that was just not compatible with what I wanted to do. Like the kind of work that I'm interested in does not result in high profile publications. And so I had to make this conscious decision to be like, okay, never mind if I don't get that high profile publication, if I don't get that job, I'm just going to do what I think is interesting. And so I sort of viewed graduate school as this like 6-year period where I had the luxury of doing what I thought was interesting. And that included science stuff, but it also included lots of non-science stuff. So like I spent a lot of time, as you know, learning how to write for broad audiences, and like doing like journalism and journalism adjacent stuff in popular science writing. And that has been tremendously useful. And like it just empowered me to have the sense that I was not beholden to this system where there were not a lot of jobs and not a lot of job security. And that was very, from a psychological standpoint, very helpful for me. So like finding ways, I think my advice in this front would be like finding ways in which you build up the safety and the security that you need, and by giving yourself those options is really important for anything.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's awesome advice. Thank you very, very
Thanks.
much. I'm sure my students are going to really enjoy watching this interview. And I bet they'll also enjoy reading some of your writings.
Awesome. If they have any questions, they should feel free to reach out to me.
Great. Awesome. I will encourage them to do that.